And then I have some from Exodus chapter 1 through 2:10. That was a couple of weeks ago, so if anybody needs those slides, I have a few of those extra as well. That would have been from the middle of January. All right. Well, I take that back. I have a couple more from last week, if anybody else needs any slides from last week. This week should be chapter 3, and then there should also be a slide going around that has something on the top and then something on the bottom that has to do with literary maps. And for instance, since the Bible is written communication, it does follow some forms of just commonality with other types of writings, and so some of it's theological, and you've heard me say often that there's not a way for the author to highlight or to bold print or to italics or to underline, and so often in both the Hebrew and the Greek, if they wanted to stress something, they would either use emphatic language, so that the maybe verb tenses or things of that nature would be changed, or that they would use repetition, saying it over and over and over again. And one of the tools that shows up in Exodus is repetitive language that shows up in like a parallelism, where you would have the author say something and then have some other little bits of information and then say it again. And so whenever that happens, or at least the most dominant ones, I'll pass those out so you can see that. And what you have today, not in the slides, but in the literary map, particularly what goes on at maybe about the 1,000-meter view, when you look at Moses' calling, or if we want to call it Moses' calling, that shows up in chapter 3 when he's at the burning bush. So you got burning bush experience, and then you've got what we would call maybe like a second vision that takes place, and all this is from chapters 3 through 5, I think. And now there's some stuff that takes place in between that. One, he returns to Egypt, and he talks to the elders, and he talks to Pharaoh, and it doesn't go well. And so, he has this God experience here, and he has this God experience there. Well, if we're just reading, down every verse and not paying attention to the larger scope or sections of the book, then we'll miss that these are two visions that are, one's a front end and one's a back end, because if you look at the type of person Moses is going into this, and then the type of person Moses is coming out, he's different.
What was the second one?
Around chapter 5, somewhere in that neighborhood. All right, hang on. Okay. Yeah, I got it. I'll wait a second till everybody calms down, and we'll start it over. Ma'am? Put stars. Yes.
What role is being handed down verbally? Do you believe it's handed down verbally?
Yeah, the writing of it always comes afterwards.
Okay.
And the odds on Moses actually writing this, we don't know. I mean, it's accredited to him, but.
But I meant the style and.
Right, sure.
Would that be memorized or
Um,
when they wrote it?
It obviously has some level of an editor's. Obviously, the person who writes it down does have some level of editing that takes place. For instance, now the question is asked, most of the scriptures, with the exception of the epistles in the Old Testament, much of it was oral tradition first, and then, codified in writing afterwards. The Gospels are the same way, with the exception of Luke's Gospel. I mean, Luke's gospel starts with the idea of, I've investigated the sources, now I'm going to put together the gospel for you, and he sends it to a person. And so the question is, did the oral tradition have something like this, or is that some levels of edits? I would argue that it's some levels of edits, but that's okay. I mean, the way we approach writing and our understanding of history is different today than what it was back then. So again, don't ask of the Bible something that the Bible is not trying to answer. For instance, if we were to talk about history, we would want at 8:01 a.m. this happened. At 9:02 a.m. this happened, and we would get every single aspect of description to give an understanding of the event. The Bible is comfortable with giving you a theological description, so it sees it through the eyes of the editor and who has either experienced it firsthand and then is writing with the principal person, or who has the principal person is giving them information to that or about that. But that is the scriptures are comfortable with that. I would argue that Moses probably didn't. If Moses is dictating, he probably talked about first vision and then second vision. The editor is going to arrange some of that according to his what he's trying to prove or get across. The Bible's not trying to convince you that God exists and that God has acted. It assumes it. Okay? I mean, it's an insider's book. And where Protestants get in trouble is we like to use it as confirmation to prove the existence of God to outside people. Well, I mean, that might happen, and it can and does, but that's not the primary purpose of the use of Scripture. I mean, does that make sense? It's an insider's book. It's written to people. This is written to people who would know the law, who would be, this would be levels of encouragement. It'd be levels of remembrance, things of that nature. So and their approach to it is different than compared to how we would approach history or how we even approach writing. Now, there are some things that are similar. I mean, when you apply higher criticism to Shakespeare or to prose or whatever, and you look for ways that the author writes, because it's written communication, some of that will apply here. And that's okay. I mean, that's not a bad thing. That's just the way that we process writing in general. And does that make sense? I hope I'm answering your question. But anyway, we're going to, don't worry about this. We're going to get to this, all right? And so, but we're going to go back and start with where we left off. I had us sort of around chapter 2, verse 11 for the most part. Is that about right for y'all's notes and whatnot? The question is, do I expect you to remember this? Absolutely. So who else is going to keep us on task? I mean, so he just has a vision. I mean, God. Both of these are visions, okay? And see what the purpose is. This, and this is going to be our introductory into the lesson today. I argued last week that Moses has experienced early on in his life, now not baby Moses, but young adult Moses, some defeats or some bad experiences. I think you can make a case that either a usurping of the throne from Pharaoh, or at least an idea early on that he saw himself as some level of deliverer for the children of Israel. His first experience that is horrible, and he ends up leaving Egypt basically in the equivalent of, in the middle of the night, getting out of Dodge because he's got a death warrant on his head. He ends up in a place called Midian. We really don't know where Midian is. It's somewhere down this area, way over here. He meets, first thing he meets is some women. He ends up marrying one of them. He defends them. The father of the daughters gives him a job. But his job is shepherding on the backside of nowhere. And he has a child. And the description of the child is very significant for us. And this is what we're going to get into today. And so when we follow Moses through, the temptation is for us is that we know how the story ends, okay? And so we want to quickly go from Moses baby in the Nile to Moses with Pharaoh, to Moses at burning bush, to Moses as deliverer and God's instrument for redemption, Moses in the Ten Commandments, Moses down all the way till he dies, and then turns it over to Joshua, and then we're all into conquest. And just don't resist that temptation. Don't go so fast. Stay with the text. And so we meet Moses. He is in the Nile. He is saved. His first experiences are not good. Now, whether or not you agree with me on the usurping of the throne, that's okay. That's not a deal breaker. But what is common is that whatever Moses was attempting, it did not work. And so when we find him in Jethro's house, and he gives a description of his child and the name, it's pretty low. So that sets the stage. That's at the end of chapter 2, which we're going to talk about. That sets the stage for his first vision. So let's let's pray, and then we'll get into the text. God, as we gather in your name, we give thanks for your love and your mercy. We ask, O Lord, for you to bless this time, our time of fellowship, our time of learning, our time of reflection. What we hope in these moments is that we are not just open to each other and open to the Scriptures, but that we are open to your Spirit. That's what we really need, and how you can take a text and that becomes a means, and you use it in such a way that our end is different. And our end is to look like the image of Christ. And so ultimately in these moments, that's what we hope for. And so we grant you this time, and we grant it to you in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, so if someone will read verse 11 through 15 in chapter 2. Right, if you would just keep on reading.
Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well.
Okay, so at least in this passage, we do have something that Moses was attempting to do, whether it be just simple standing up for human decency, whether it be something, self-perception of deliverer, or some type of leader of Hebrews, of Israelites, or whether it be maybe using that massive amount of people in such a way that eventually that would lead for him to usurp the throne. All that is open to interpretation, and we don't have enough evidence to kind of land on any of those. But I think at least you can draw some levels of conclusions from the text that Moses, because a prince could kill another and not be in jeopardy with Pharaoh. That's what the law, it couldn't kill in general, but a prince in the house of Pharaoh, had enough power that to kill someone else, he could get away with that. There's all kinds of evidence of that, of the ruling party being able to do that. Moses, via adoption, was a part of the ruling party in some form or fashion. I mean, he's probably not on the higher end, but he's adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He would have some level of status, and so he could get by with killing slave driver. Okay, and so why he did it, that is open to debate. I would argue that all of a sudden, since Pharaoh gets wind of it, Pharaoh puts a death warrant on it, it is more than just a common killing. That this would have to be with some level of intent behind it that would at least land on the radar of Pharaoh in enough way that Pharaoh is going to act. Now, again, inside of that, we've got some leeway of what that might be. But nonetheless, Pharaoh does put out some level of warrant on Moses. Moses is afraid. Moses leaves and goes to Midian. Okay, those are not, that's according to the text. Those are really not open to debate. Why he did it, we can spend all types of time on conjecture on this, but at least what he did, we know that he did it, and he's on the run. And so if somebody would pick up with verse 16 and would read all the way through the rest of the chapter, which would be verse 25, I think that would be most helpful.
Now priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and killed the frogs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him?" "Inviting to have something to eat." So Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughters Zipporah to Moses to marry. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become an alien in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
Okay, thank you. So what we have now is, at least what I would argue, some more information about what's going on inside of Moses' psyche. He leaves, he goes to Midian. There still is this, evidently there was something going on at the well, maybe some harassment. He defends these women. He ends up meeting probably the major landowner in that area. He marries one of the daughters. He has a son. Now, because names are very significant in the Old Testament, names give us, in the Old Testament, a name is either a description of current reality or a description of future hopings, of a desired future. And so both of those, regardless of which way we go on a name itself, Moses' description of the name of his son is important. I'm no longer in Pharaoh's household with status. I'm now been reduced to, I'm an alien in a foreign land. And I think that sets a stage for us to understand what's going on inside of Moses' life, where, at least some level of status where he thought he could go out and do, at least do something with Israelites in Egypt. That goes south. He's on the run. He ends up marrying this woman. They have a child, and he considers himself some level of an alien living in a foreign land. On top of that, when we're not in in chapter 3, but he is working for his father-in-law. That, to me, gives us at least some insight into Moses at this point. If with that information, would you say that Moses perceives himself as something great, or do you see him perceiving himself as at least something on a downward spiral.
Probably has gained a great deal of humility.
Right. Well, we hope he would, because it.
Makes him much more open.
Oh, sure. Well, we don't know yet. All right. So we just may be open, but at least some level of licking wounds. We would hope that anybody in this situation has some level of reflection. But even if he doesn't, he definitely doesn't see himself as Prince of Egypt.
Was that any kind of part of payback when you marry a man stronger like it was with, what's his name? Jacob. Yeah.
I mean, working for the father-in-law? I mean, it could be. I mean, some of it was the economies of those days. I mean, we don't know insight. I mean, I can't imagine, at least the text doesn't tell us that Moses leaves with a sack of gold. And so, I mean,
I just mean as part of the,
just the culture that, I mean, it could be. I mean, it could be some of that. It could be just needing to live. It could be, if I am an alien in a foreign land, obviously I don't have any holdings myself. I've got to live. And so it very well could be. Right, yeah. I mean, because up until verse 23, when what Sally read is, after a long time the king dies. Well, that could have ended the death warrant, or, we don't know if the next in line would have continued it, but at least we know it's a long time, and obviously could have a change in administration in Egypt. So those are all good questions to ask, but probably more of necessity working for father-in-law than some aspect of trying to show tribute or something like that to his father-in-law. I mean, obviously he's got to end. He's married his daughter. I don't know many fathers that would want their daughter and then their grandchildren to go, to go in trouble. Right. Well, but no, I mean, seriously. Up until modern times, childbearing was, we want to have as many children as we can. One, because you have infant mortality is fairly high. And so, the more you have, the odds are better that some will live. And then at the same time, their hands and backs. And so, so some of it is a necessity type. And you could see people living and working for obviously someone who has the means, probably owns a ton of land. And that was the way that people had wealth. Middle class is not created yet. You don't even have a merchant type class. I mean, the way for the long, from here for the next, probably 3,000 years is going to be, if you own land, you're wealthy. If you don't, tough. You're going to work for someone that does. And, right. I mean, so Moses is probably young too. I mean, this is probably a young man, and he's just starting out. I mean, we don't have any insight that he has resources of his own. He's left that. And so, he's on his own. So either necessity, easy in with father-in-law. I mean, I would imagine if you married the boss's daughter, that doesn't hurt you. So, I mean, there's some good things there.
Is there any significance to Moses' father-in-law having two different names?
Not because his wife has two different names too. I mean, we get her a different name later on. We don't know. I mean, there's no, Jacob's name changes to Israel. So I mean, Jethro, we do find him later on after the Exodus experience, and this is fairly significant. There's no indication that anybody is a believer in Yahweh because Yahweh's name has not been revealed yet. The name of God, there's about 6 or 7 different names of God that shows up in Genesis. They all are the El based. Elohim, El Shaddai, it's God, and then whatever function God is doing, and then there's a word that describes that. In a moment, Moses is going to meet Yahweh, which is an intimate, personal name for God. And when Moses goes through the plagues, goes through these 4 different, goes through the Red Sea, and then these 3 or 4 other incidents where God provides food, water, and also protection against the Ammonites, I think. When he comes out of that and he's getting ready to go to Sinai, Jethro enters back into the text because we have him here, but then we don't hear about him again until chapter 19, I think. And when there's something that's very significant that says he comes to Moses. Moses informs him of what God has done, and then it talks about Jethro agreeing to that. So maybe the name change there could be because you've got some level of Jethro now is a believer in what Moses believes in because of the word of Moses.
When did Moses acquire his knowledge of the Hebrew tradition?
Well, we made an assumption. One of the things we talked about last week is an assumption, or the week before, was that because his mother is the equivalent of the one that raises him under Pharaoh's daughter, that Moses sort of has the best of both worlds. He grows up in an Egyptian household of means, which means he would have been exposed to all the different aspects. And the Egyptians were pretty smart people now, okay? I mean, they're not back, the Hebrews were considered the backwoods, okay? This is the upper crust type. But he also gets old school Hebrew because mom is going to also inform him of, our way of life. And so Moses sort of has the best of both worlds, where he gets a fair amount of Egyptian culture and learning, and he also has a fair amount of Hebrew understanding. One of the other components that would be good because what we find in Moses, and this is what you see in the first 2 chapters, what you're getting is some introductory remarks of what the world is like for them. You get to see what's going on in Egyptian life here. You see a little bit what's going on in Hebrew life in here. It's not good. But you also get to see an intimate or an up-close look at some of the things that are going on with Moses' life. I would argue those are on purpose. Now, it doesn't give you the day-to-day activities of Moses, but it gives you those high points of what's going on in Moses' life, because though he operates out of his experiences, okay? Up until now, his experiences pretty much have went downward. All right, he started out, maybe best of both worlds, and then, he's got some, we just read 4 or 5 different events in his life. He's rolling snake eyes. This guy's not doing well. And so now he finds himself working for father-in-law, probably because he has to. So it's not a bad thing, but he is shepherding out, and shepherds, you didn't go and punch at 8 o'clock and go out and shepherd and come home at 5 and punch and sit down and eat dinner with the family. You just kind of meandered your way around all the countryside, and you'd be gone for a long period of time and then come back. Now, that was a way of life, but, has a son. He's reduced to, we're all foreigners in this land, and this is where he's at. And so, but that gives us insight, because in chapter 3, we begin this first vision. All right? And that's significant, because in chapter 3, we haven't got to chapter 3. I'm going to deal with 23 through 25 real quick. There are a number of verbs that show up. Does anybody have in the text, in verse 23, after a long time the king of Egypt died, the Israelites groaned under their slavery? Do you have anything else other than groaned? Cried out. How about moaned? Anybody have that? Okay, and then you've got they groaned under their slavery and cried out. And then you've got out of slavery. What's after that? Out of their slavery. And what's the next? Do you have a different word other than their cry for help rose to God? Say that again? They pleaded. Okay, yeah, pleaded. All right, and then in verse 24, what we got is actually Hebrew is they moaned, they shrieked, and they cried out. And the idea is, if you think about it in terms of this, the moaning is a natural response to the trouble that they were in. The shrieking is a natural response to the affliction that was going on. Remember in chapter 1, from verse 15 or around maybe 13 through the rest of the chapter, the wording that is used describes, actually it's in where it says ruthless, verse 13, chapter 1, verse 13. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and with brick and every kind of field labor. the word there for ruthless is actually used 2 times. If we were to keep reading, actually denotes physical violence. And so, I mean, they're crying out, or they're pleading, they're moaning out of as a natural response, crying out in prayers for a difference. But what it is, it's 3 distinct words to describe what the Israelites are doing now. And notice that the text talks about God hearing this. But their life didn't change immediately. Right? Because we don't have a verse 26 in chapter 2 that said God went down and put a whooping on Pharaoh. Right? I mean, you got them crying out, you got God, and there's verbs used for what God does. God looks upon them. It also uses the verb to know. Knowing in the Old Testament is a very interesting word that always implies intimate relationships between people or between 2 parties. It's the deepest, most personal intimacy of mutual knowledge 2 humans can experience. In Psalm 1:6, it says, God knows the ways of the righteous. Same concept there. And so the idea is God is very much aware of what's going on with the children of Israel, with the Israelites. And God is, we don't find out until 3, 7, and 8 that God's concern will lead him to come down and to act. All we know now, and again, don't read ahead. All we know now is that the children of Israel have cried out. God has heard, and God is aware. And so what?
Now, hadn't they been there about 400 years?
They've been there a while. You're right, absolutely. And so, one of the things that we talked about in our second lesson was you get this description of what's going on, and you really don't have. It's a lot of years before God acts, and how do we sit with that? And and we can make the same question here about prayer. All right, so. You can interpret this, at least I think it's safe to interpret this, that they are crying out, moaning, praying for some level of help. Well, what's the purpose of prayer? Is the purpose of prayer to disclose our needs to God so that God can act? Is prayer is just a means by which God can hear, at least our own expressions? Is prayer just a means of reflection where it really doesn't have to do with changing life or changing reality as much as it is for personal growth? Because I would argue that at least here, the prayers of crying out is because they want their life to change. I mean, is that fair? So when we pray, what's the whole purpose for praying? Is it for God to act, or is it for us to grow?
Communicate with God.
Okay, so just communicate?
Because sometimes you're thinking.
Well, but that's still communication. That's expressing our needs, maybe God hearing it. Right, so there's which one? Okay, that's all right, good, that's okay. That's all right. Star for everybody, all right? Who said all right? So everybody gets a star. So, that's it. It's a little bit of everything. And obviously there are times of prayer where it is personal expression. And think about what happens when someone is heard. All right? Think about what happens when someone has an opportunity to express the needs on the inside, whether or not they're heard or not. How does that make you feel? At least some level of, okay. All right? So there's a level of help there. What happens when it's heard? You feel validated. All right? And, and if it's not heard or expressed, then how's there going to be at least some level of communication on the other end, right? How often have somebody wanted something or wanted you to do something, you had no clue, and then your response is, well, why didn't you tell me? All right? So, and I would argue that in prayer, there's all of this. And the net effect is that God hears. God knows. I mean, that's what verse 20, verse 25 says. God looked upon the Israelites and God took notice of them. Right? I mean, it hadn't changed yet. We haven't seen any change in what's going on in their life. We just know that at least now God knows about it. Okay? Which is good.
You know, maybe I should know this, but I don't think I do. At this time, had God already declared that these people, or?
That's a great question to ask. I mean, obviously he refers to himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So there is, and obviously they are, the Hebrews that are in Egypt are their descendants. So, at least on one level there is where you could imply God at least is aware of that. There's some level of connection there. But when we get into the plagues, one of the things that shows up in the text is, and if you want to grant me the battleground, okay, between Pharaoh and God, is over firstborns. The 10th plague, the prize is firstborns. And firstborns in that day was very significant in pretty much every culture. And so, what is the Passover about? Who is in jeopardy over the Passover? Firstborns. And before we get to the Passover, God is actually going to say to Moses, Israel is my firstborn. And so at least now the stakes are where I would argue coming out of Passover, and I don't want to, I'll give you the short version. I don't want to unpack why I believe this, but from the Bible, there is some level of claiming that takes place in Passover that we don't have here. So to what degree, to answer your question in the affirmative, I'd have to give a wide margin. Did God forget? Yeah. Right, sure. But what's interesting is it says God remembered His covenant. You would think that God would not forget it in the first place. Right. I'm playing on words. I'm not being nice. So I'll strike that from the record. So, but what we find, and again, this is something for us to contemplate. We ask these questions of the book of Exodus, and they're fair questions to ask. The Bible's just not concerned with answering them. Okay? I mean, this whole concept of remembering covenant, maybe possibly, why does God have to be prompted to remember? Shouldn't He know that? We're applying levels of faith and theology, our understanding, to the text, but the text is comfortable with not answering that question. It's giving you description of events that just led up to certain key points in the book of Exodus. And one of the major key points is the plagues coming out of with the Passover. When the children of Israel leave Egypt, that ends the first major section of the book of Exodus. And it has to do with the theme of God as liberator and redeemer. Once they leave Egypt, the theme changes from God as liberator and redeemer to God as sustainer. The issues at stake are not about God liberating the people from. It's now that they have been liberated, what happens? Well, we get into where there's all kind of issues that take place. And then we move into a time of God as indweller amongst the community, because once they receive law and sacrificial system, their life has changed some. And so inside the book of Exodus, it's important to stay inside the book of Exodus for, while we're reading through. If we get out of the book of Exodus, and it's okay to ask questions of it, but just know that the book itself, this particular book, Exodus, might not answer it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have an answer later on in another book or whatnot. It's just not concerned with answering it with this particular text. Does that make sense? Because it's trying to answer other questions. All right? Is that good? And that's important. I mean, it's real important in the Old Testament, more so than in the New Testament, mainly because when you read in the New Testament, Paul writes with this all-inclusive type. He gives you about 1,000 run-on sentences to tell you God is love. I mean, he's trying to answer every question that there is, and it's different. It's a different scope. So just with Exodus, it's okay to ask them. Just park them in your parking lot for a while, and let's just see what happens as the story unfolds. Okay? I know we need to take a break, so why don't we take about a 5 to 7 minute break? Okay, let's go ahead and come together. Just a word of announcement. I think most of you are aware of this, but one of the ministries that I think is just a delightful ministry of our church is altar flowers that are given and used in worship. On Monday, we break those down and then we send them out to the community, maybe with people that might be going through particular circumstances or whatnot in their life. And it's just a way of acknowledging who they are, and it's just a way of saying that we care and love you. Sunday's flowers were, not just beautiful, but they were in abundance, which means that we have a fair amount of flowers left. So if you know of anybody in our community, they don't have to be a part of St. Paul, okay? But if you know of anybody in our community that you think just a small arrangement of that would be helpful to their life, if you would please tell Noxie, is that okay? I'm volunteering you. If you would tell Noxie on your way out. Or if you get home, just email Kathy back, and because we would hate for those flowers to go to waste, and that we keep them in a cooler, but they've got a shelf life.
Can we go in there and get some and take them to an ambulance?
Sure, I think that'd be fine. Right. Someone asked, can I go and get them to save somebody from making the trip? That's fine too. So for chapter 3, is there anybody got any extra chapter 3s? We printed out 47. We did. So we need some more. Okay. There's only one sheet. Well, here's one right here. So we got one here. Is anybody else? If you'd make maybe 10 or so, that'd probably be good. All right. Any other announcements? Did I miss anything? I don't think so. Make sure I'm on. Okay. We'll get back into the text. And so at least right now we know that Moses is somewhere with his father-in-law in a foreign land. We know that the Hebrew people have cried out. We know that God has heard. God is aware. And so when we get to chapter 3 is when we see God starting to act. We don't know time-wise. We're going to hear 40 years. Now again, we don't know in the Old Testament is not as clear with numbers as the New Testament is, as whether or not they're literal or not. Numbers often can be right. I mean, it could be poetic use, theological use. I mean, obviously there are theological numbers, or at least numbers that have a theological meaning that show up in the Bible: 40, 12, 3. 1,000, things of that. And what they normally describe is either completeness or, a long period or a complete time. And so whether or not it's literal 40 years or whether or not it's just a long time, and in that season of long time, whatever was supposed to be learned or happen, it did. Okay, so, but, you can, we don't know. So, I mean, you can, there's some who lean more towards the literal, and that's fine, and there's some who don't. So it's okay. You won't be excommunicated from the church, regardless of which one you hold to, and so it's all good. All right. So who needs chapter 3 slides? Anybody? All right. So just a few. Okay. So we get into chapter 3, and what we have is the introduction of Moses as of a great leader. All this begins now, and or at least there's things that have happened that at least now he has this encounter with God, and that begins levels of transformation. So if somebody would read chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, that would be great. All right?
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, who led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at the great sight, and see why the bush is
here I am. Then he said, come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
All right, thank you, Betty. So what we have is Moses on Mount Horeb, also Sinai. Those are used interchangeably in the text. Same mountain. We don't know if, Horeb is historically called the mountain of God. So we don't know if that name was in place before this experience, or if because of this experience it is called the mountain of God. Real similar to what takes place in history, where like when a baby is born, and let's just say a baby girl is born and she later becomes queen. What they would say as a queen is born. Well, she wasn't queen then, but she will be queen, and so it could be one of those type deals. We don't know if this is already Mountain of God or if it became Mountain of God afterwards. But we do know that it's very significant. Mountains are always significant in the Old Testament, and not just in Christian or Jewish understandings of text, but even in other religions, mountains are normally set aside for places of visits with God. We get to chapter 19 on a mountain, chapter 34 on a mountain, and so it's just maybe I don't know. It could be. We there's some things like the mountain is normally set aside geographically as a place to meet God. The sea is normally set aside as a place for trouble. And in Revelation, and was it 21? The sea is no more. All right, the sea in the book of Revelation is a place of wrestling, and normally wrestling against. Jonah goes into the sea. That's another example. Well, that shows up. That's in the Old Testament, but that shows up in as it is sins. The imagery there is poetic. Is that sins are, basically sent under something and not remembered anymore, or lost to. Well, not so much washed away. That's not a concept yet in those particular, but it's the idea of another example would be sins. God remembers no more your sins, or forgiveness is, from east to west. The idea is that this is a great big period of time, and it's not something that's right in front of him. So. Yeah, so this is common. This is it's common in the Old Testament. Whether or not I wouldn't say that the mountain, all mountain visits with God has its origin here. This is just common to people of that day, and still common to our day. But we have here, for at least in the Old Testament, Mount Horeb as a name that is set aside for the mountain of God. All right, so some things to notice: that Moses is confronted by God, and it will lead to his change via this confrontation. But it's progressive. Moses, when he leaves this experience, this is what I want you to see and what we were talking about early on, is that we have Moses going before chapter 3. He kills somebody in Midian, marries, has a son, shepherding. There's all kind of things that we've kind of speculated on, at least what's going on in Moses' life, physically, emotionally, things of that nature. In chapter 3, he's on a mountain, burning bush experience. That's what we just looked at. And there are some events that take place between chapter 3 and chapter 5, verse 22. But in chapter 5, verse 22, he has another experience with God. Now, we don't know if this is on a mountain, because it doesn't tell us. All right? My assumption is that it's probably not. But, we don't know. But he has a second vision, or a second confrontation with God, or visit with God, interaction with God. And from this second vision or interaction, he definitely is different. Okay? So, one of the questions that we can ask is, why two? Did he just not get on the first one? Okay, No, I do not. Because he goes from the first vision, he goes back down to talk to Pharaoh and the elders of the children of Israel, tells them what has experienced on the first visit, and it goes badly. And so then in chapter 5, verse 22, it says he goes back to God. So I don't see it as a continual vision. That's right. I mean, well, the reason what I want you to do is I want you to see this from the 1,000-meter view, okay? From the sky view, okay? You're in the sky box here, all right? And I want you to look down and see not just we're going to look at the text. We're going to look at each one of these individually, but I want you to see this at least from a larger view of what's going on inside the life of Moses, particularly asking the question about transformation or change, whatever word we're going to talk about. With Moses, there's levels of progression. Okay? Now, I would argue that is true of human nature in general. All right? So, and throughout the history of the church, we don't always talk about it in those types of terms. Often when we're describing transformation, we might talk about it in terms of justification, which is instantaneous. But that is a legal term and a legal concept to describe status before God. And so if you grew up in a evangelical, revivalist type environment where you've heard words like born again and get saved and things of that nature, mostly what we're talking about is an instantaneous act that what we're talking about is the theological concept of justification. I am guilty before God because of sin. I ask God for forgiveness. My status before God has changed at that moment. That's something that God has done. God has given. God is the one who does this, okay? And it's instantaneous. Born again. Well, you can't be unborn, correct? I mean, when you're born, right? Okay? You can't go back and say, no, I was just kidding. I mean, it is what it is. It's a moment in time. It happens. Once it happens, it happens. And so that's what, in the New Testament, when you read certain scriptures, and you, like, say, Acts or something, and it talks about, it doesn't use the word conversion. That's a later word. But it talks about justification or saved or things of that nature. That is momentary, instantaneous, and it is a status change, how God sees you differently. So when Paul writes about this a lot, when he writes in the epistles and he talks to people who we would probably not call saintly in their function or behavior or in their action, but he calls them saints. Why? Because they have been justified already. You with me? All right. And at the same time, there's the concept of sanctification, which is a progressive change, which means there's a time element, which, this is something that is 100% done by God. This is something that is done by God and the person working together. They're living into how God sees them. All right? Does that make sense? And so the Bible talks about this is the act of salvation. Okay? And so there are times when the Bible talks about salvation and it's talking about this only. There are times when the Bible's talking about salvation, it's talking about this only. And there's times when it's talking about salvation and it's talking about all of this. Which is why you have all three tenses to describe salvation. I was saved. I am being saved at this very moment, and I will be saved in the future. And you can, if you just get isolated on that one particular area, well, which one is it? Well, I mean, but it is all of them. But I mean, it's all. My point is that if you just stay in the 1 meter view, it's hard to denote which one is the text talking about. because it talks about all three of these at different portions. And so I want you to see the larger scope of the change that takes place in Moses, or at least the beginnings of that change, and what are the components behind it. And the two principal components, and they're the same one. He has a vision of God. Okay? And so let's get into chapter 3 and look at this first vision. Okay? So if somebody would read 7 through 12. All right?
Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard them cry out on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites. Did I go to?
No, you keep going.
Okay. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God.
Okay, thank you. So what we have is at least levels of job description now for Moses. And there obviously is some description of God being God of Isaac, Jacob, and Abraham. God has observed the misery of my people. That's the first time that phrase is used from God's perspective. He's heard their cry. Remember those different verbs that are used to describe how God, what the Hebrews are experiencing, and then they match up with the verbs that describe what God has witnessed and seen. And so God is basically filling Moses in on the larger picture. This is what's been going on. I have seen that. And then, of course, you get the first level of some level of contesting with Moses is, well, you know, who are you? I mean, who am I? And then you got who are you, and there's 5 of them that we'll look at. What's interesting, though, is when God comes, is it God or is it the angel of the Lord? Yeah, well, which one is it? It could be both, so it's God and an angel. Well, now in the movie, it's a little boy, right, or a little girl. What is it? It's a little boy. And so we, it's Charleston. Yeah, exactly. Well, Charleston Heston's Moses. So, but we don't. And I'm.
Maybe it's Moses' perception that he first sees burning bush and to him it's an angel. And he realizes it is God.
I mean, it could be. In the Old Testament, both are they're used interchangeably. I mean, the word for angel means messenger, and the idea is that these are God's worker bees. Well, I mean, that could be right. However, we don't get insight into that, so we're speculating.
This may be the oral tradition.
It could be, So, but in we don't know if it's actually an angel or if it's God or if it's both. That's one of these where the Bible's not trying to answer that question. In the Old Testament, in Exodus, and then if we were to get outside of Exodus and look at the larger scope, stay inside the line of writing, which would be the Torah. Then we want to get larger than that, historicals, prophets, whatnot. The angel of the Lord and God Himself in giving messages or coming for visits of people are used interchangeably, and it's both seen as, whether it's God Himself speaking or whether it be the angel speaking from God, it's still the same, it's perceived the same way. Does that make sense? Well, how do you know? We don't know that yet. I mean, he sees the angel or he sees a burning bush. We don't. Now, later on, we get where he wants to see God and God has to cover his eyes and he sees the backside of God. But again, that's down the road. We haven't gotten there that far. That's, I think, in chapter 34 or 33 or something like that. Yeah, it is a long way. A lot of things got to happen. And so, but the angel's there. Notice that there's fire present. Fire in Exodus is very important, and it normally denotes some level of God's presence. So that's at least we get the beginnings of that here. Now, God says this place is holy. So let's talk a minute about holiness, all right? What actually do we mean when we talk about holiness? Is it unapproachable brightness or otherness, or does it mean separateness? All right, good. Y'all got it. So, because there are times in the Old Testament where there are people that we might not think are holy, but in the understanding that they're separate, they are considered holy. For instance, in Genesis chapter 38, there is a woman who is treated badly, and she is perceived to be a common prostitute. She is not a prostitute, but she is a temple servant, and in pagan cultures, temple servants involve sexual activity. She is considered holy because she is set apart for divine worship. Not worship of Yahweh, but see, you got to see the understanding of the words. Holiness as unapproachable brightness is different from holy as being separate. For instance, take ordination. We call ordination, in some denominations, ordination is a holy sacrament. In other denominations, ordination is a holy activity. It might not be called sacrament, but it's definitely up there. What happens is in ordination is not that someone is granted some higher level of whatever. It's just they've been set apart, separate from the rest for their gifts to be used in a certain way. Not any more. The difference between laity and clergy doesn't mean anything. Except for inside the church, where what we say is that one has been set apart, not for higher status, but for different work. Does that make sense? Holy. But laity are called holy too, all right? So, my point is, we see this and we say, gosh, this is holy, God is present. And what we say is that the reason it's holy is because it is separate. Okay, that's fine. But there are other people in the Bible who are considered holy in that understanding of the name, and you might not say they are holy. Genesis 38. Would you consider a person who has given themselves to God for use of worship? That's pagan culture, and in their style of worship there is sexual activity. But in that understanding of holiness, you would call her holy too, because she's been set apart for divine activity. So, but in the I'm not trying to trick you. I just want you to see that there are multiple definitions inside the Bible for holiness. One of them is actually unapproachable otherness. Okay? Another one is that they have been set aside for certain activity. And so if we see this as holy as in unapproachable otherness, yeah, okay. If we see it as separateness, you can make a case for that too. But just know what you're saying if you see it as separateness. Anybody that's been set aside for a certain activity with God is considered holy, whether or not we would say their function is holy. You with me? So there would be no difference between Moses and the woman. But that doesn't sit well with us, so just let it marinate for a while. And but there's multiple definitions of holy.
We have always been taught or had the impression that holiness was holy.
Otherness. That's right. So, and it's okay to say otherness here. Obviously God's present. That makes the place holy. What's holy is not because Moses is present. What's holy is because God is present. But in the Old Testament, there are multiple meanings to the word holy. Some of them are unapproachable otherness. All right?
Maybe we can start teaching that to the little children so they don't come up thinking holy means.
Holy means what?
Just holy, God.
As in unapproachable otherness? That can be scary. If you think about it. If holiness is always seen, as in I'm carrying the ark and it goes to fall and I have good intentions and I reach my hand out to pick the ark up so it doesn't fall in the River Jordan and I die. Well, that doesn't sound fair. I'd rather God be separate and not otherness. Separateness, I might live. Otherness, I'm going to die. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm talking about? Both, they're not interchangeably, okay? But normally when holiness describes a person in the Old Testament, what I want you to do is read some of the context around it, because a person can be seen holy because they are set aside for a work for God, not just Yahweh. I'm talking about divinity, okay? Could be pagan God, okay? And in their culture, there would be an understanding of they are holy, all right? Because of what their function will be. Their life now belongs to God. And because they're God's, they are considered holy. When the temple is built and they bless the instruments of the temple, they have a wave offering. You know what that is? They just take some oil and they just kind of wave it out. Some of the drops fall on the stuff, some of it doesn't. But it's an act that then says even the wood or the metal now is holy because it belongs to God. It is separate. So you don't use it for the common. It is not unapproachable otherness. Does that make sense? And so when we talk about God, it's often seen as unapproachable otherness. When we talk about things, and people could be a part of that, we're normally talking about separateness. They belong to God, and so they are holy, even if their function is not what we would call a holy function. So who said that? Yeah, yeah, exactly right. I mean, and the reason, one of the reasons why you are considered holy is because God owns you. That's what baptism means. Well, congratulations. Now you know. So I mean, you belong to God, and I mean, that's there's about 4 or 5 things that what we mean when we baptize. Baptism is the water is God, the sacrament. God is claiming you as His own. All right, that means you're holy. All right, there are probably times when you look at your life and you think, maybe, it's a good group of bunch here. The men, we're on Friday, maybe not. All right, how about that? So, but you are. I mean, even when your functions are not absolute otherness. All right? That's part of what this is. God acts, God makes you holy, God claims you, God owns you. Now, part of it is you got to live into that. Well, sometimes that might look like holy, sometimes that might not. But in God's eyes, it's holy. Okay? And so it's good to know, and the context is the key, okay, in the larger scope of Scripture of what concept. Sometimes you get in the Hebrew. Some of the Hebrew words make that easier for us than others. But the context helps more than anything else. So anyways, just wanted you to know that. Because if God is unapproachable otherness, then you have to ask the question, then how do we approach God? I might reach my hand out, touch the ark, get killed. Well, I don't like that. That's not the prescription I want to live into. And what we'll discover in Exodus, which is also further explained throughout the rest of the Scripture, is God gives you the prescription and dictates how to approach Him. And when you go outside of that is when you deal with the consequences of unapproachable otherness. Does that make sense? So later on, when we get into conquest and where God gives moral code, then gives sacrificial system of what happens when moral code is violated, and the children, and we're talking about this in the Kings, okay, on Sunday mornings, and moral code is not followed, then you live into life outside of God, or you deal directly with God in unapproachable otherness. And the Scriptures talk about that in both ways. Take a look at Revelation. There's a part where in the beginning, and throughout a large portion of the book of Revelation, what John is describing is life outside of God's kingdom. When we move to the latter parts of Revelation, you not only get God outside of people outside of God's kingdom, but you get the results of what it means ultimately then to face a God who is of unapproachable otherness. Does that make sense? That's what you find in before all that happens, you find time and you find a lot of grace. But eventually we all have to deal with the fact that God is a holy God, and all of us at some point, whenever that might be, we are confronted with an unapproachable other God. Does that make sense? Now you don't have to fear because this. But I mean, if you believe in justice and believe that God is a just God, you cannot have justice without judgment. They don't exist. If you want justice in any form without judgment, then you don't want justice. You just want to make the rules. I mean, just sit with that for a second. Now, that doesn't mean that God isn't gracious. Now, listen, part of it is we associate judgment with something bad. Judgment doesn't have to be something, but you make judgments every day, and they're not bad. You make all kinds of judgments about yourself, about other people, and I'd probably argue 99.99999% of them are good. It's not something that we have to be fearful of or foreign for us. But if we believe in an unapproachable holy God or unapproachable other holy God who makes a way for people to approach Him, gives prescription, gives grace and mercy, that doesn't change the desire that God wants to be with people, and that ultimately God is just, fair. Well, you can't be fair and not have at least some levels of judgment. The good news is that justice and judgment don't come quick. Where we're, constantly and always confronted with unapproachable otherness. The real thanksgiving to God is that, listen, there's sometimes I don't want God to reveal Himself to me. I might be exposed. And my function does not even equal my separateness. And I would imagine that's probably true of you too. So, the beauty of this is that God, in His love and in His justice and in His mercy, maybe He knows what He's doing. Right. So it's, we read words like fear, fear of the Lord. That's a bad word, and its interpretation should be respect of the Lord. It's the idea that you've weighed and measured the situation and you realize that you are not on the same par. That's what really fear of the Lord means. We read judgment and we think, and some of that is probably bad preaching and bad teaching. They might take a component or two of what we would say is, yes, there will be a time where there is judgment because God is just. But God doesn't start with indifference toward us. God starts with, I'm going to tip it off when we get into the Passover. What you find in the Passover in the 10th plague is very significant. It is unlike the other 9. Because it's the only one that comes with a prescription. And it's very detailed and exact. You are to do this. You are to do it this way. This is when you are to do it. Here's how you are to do it for this ultimate means so that I will pass over. So what you find with God is a God who demands perfection, otherness, but who also provides a means for the imperfect to be perfect. All right? You see it in Exodus. And it's still judgment. Okay? But it's not something that should be, should be seen with, yeah, with the magnitude and the understand that there is something different between me and God, but not something that should be a level of unapproachableness because God does not want to be with His people. Remember, the whole act behind this is that God has seen, witnessed, heard, observed, remembers, and now wants to act. That's the lesson of Exodus. And so God is the one who's dictating all this, not somebody else, because God wants to be with. God wants to redeem. God wants to liberate. Right, so, just because God requires perfection, what would be bad if there was not a means dictated by God for the imperfect to become perfect? Yeah. I tell you, go run and hide. And what's that story? I don't have to outrun everybody. I just have to outrun you. I mean, that's the kind of way we would operate, But that's not what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about a God who is perfect, but thanks be to God, gives means for imperfect to be made perfect. And notice that He's the one that does it. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, it's one thing to, and this is where we really run amok with this in the church. We think the means by which the imperfect become perfect is because we have to go and merit it. Don't raise your hands, all right? I mean, it's okay. But how many of you live that way? That's how you approach God. I've got to perform my way into love and into goodness. I mean, that's never going to happen. And I mean, and we're all guilty of that in some forms or fashion. And so we distance ourselves from people, and the judgments then we make is, because I'm not perfect, I want to be better than at least everybody else. That'll make me feel better. But I mean, that's the wrong prescription. You can't find that in the Bible. I mean, because it's also a circular movement. How do you ever become unapproachable otherness? I mean, how do you ever, you go back to, all right, uncreated creates the created. Well, uncreated, unapproachable otherness. The created is never unapproachable otherness. It will never have that attribute. And yet we think that we can assume this by performance. I mean, that happens, it's happened all throughout history. It's not just us.
Don't you think that maybe begins when you don't
Maybe.
really understand the conditions that you
Well, I mean, yeah, there is some. I mean, we live in a world that definitely promotes that. I mean, parenting sometimes, even at its best, it's still, we're not always good with that. We have to work hard to instill status of child, and that's different, or identity of child, which is different than function of child. And for instance, I mean. And I don't want you to feel bad or good whether or not you've done this. This is just an example, okay? So I'm not trying to bring up parenting or anything like that. I mean, I'll talk about myself, I guess. How often do we say, you are in trouble because you performed or did this? Most of the time we just go straight to, you're in trouble, you have done, you're bad or whatever. I mean, so we, human nature, we don't do good with it. And but it's, so what we learn is that type of, performance-oriented goodness. I mean, there's things that show up in our society that way. I mean, you perform certain levels, well, you might be higher, we got whole groups of medias and everything else that reinforce that. I mean, what's beauty? All right. I mean, what's sports greatness? What's educational? I mean, you know what I'm saying? So part of it is our structures are set up, and so we have to work hard to instill something different than that. If we leave it to chance, then what happens is we continue this performance-oriented goodness, and that sinks into the church sometimes, and. How many of you work real hard to instill in child you're great and good because you are, and now live into what you already are? That takes a lot of energy. on behalf of a parent. And, I have to watch this when I go home now, so. But I mean, it does. I mean, it's hard to do.
Isn't it also the fact that we don't have to work like that sets Christianity apart from other religions?
Well, it does. I mean, the other world religions are very performance-oriented. I mean, one of the distinctiveness of Christianity is that, that there is the concept of this aspect, God working to do that, and then live into what God has already done. I mean, a number of the other major world religions operate with you either have to go obtain something or to perform something in order to equate goodness. But I mean, that's not always the message that is preached, even inside the church. So I mean, it just gets woven into our psyche, and it's not part of what I think redemption that God, part of this is God unscrewing some of the things that we've tightened up pretty good. And, but the good news is that even in spite of all that, it doesn't change God's action for humanity and God's love for people and how God will work in ways of redemption, because that is God's nature. And sometimes it's God's nature working against our nature, even inside the church. I'm the poster boy for perfectionist-oriented salvation. I'm dead serious. I mean, I came to God out of fear, and it took me forever to really trust in grace. And I mean, I can still remember some of the major conversations I've had with God, and what I perceived was, boy, I screwed you in pretty tight. Stop trying to unscrew what I've screwed in, And so, you're working against me, and so I mean, I understand this lesson. And I mean, I'm not alone. I'd probably say that I'm maybe in the majority more than anything else. But what you find is a God who is unapproachable otherness, who requires perfection, but that's just half the story. The good news is that God provides a means by which what He knows is imperfect. Okay? What He knows is imperfect to become perfect. I mean, that's the greatest news, okay? And I mean, and it even shows up here in the very beginning of what we find in Exodus. And you'll see that in Moses. I mean, Moses is protesting here. Why do I need to go? Who am I? Well, who are you? What am I going to tell them? I need an ace in my hand. And I mean, God just kind of, all right, I'm going to deal with all these. There's 5 of them. Then set him out, and he screws it up, and he comes back and said, all right, let's go back to the drawing board. It's wonderful. All right? So we're going to stop here, pick it back up in the middle of chapter 3. Go in peace. May the Lord bless you.